I stood on the worn gravel road, staring up at the bright neon sign that read, Harper's Diner. It was a chilly evening, the kind where the wind carried a sharp bite that reminded you of colder days ahead. The diner was modest, a staple of small-town America, with its checkered curtains and chrome accents gleaming under the porch light. My stomach rumbled as I adjusted the lapel of my old jacket, the same one I'd worn since coming home from the war. The town hadn't changed much in the years I'd been away. The same brick buildings, the same oak trees lining Main Street, and unfortunately, the same attitudes. I'd heard stories from my old unit about how veterans were treated when they got back, especially ones who looked like me. But I didn't expect much trouble tonight. After all, a man's got a right to eat, doesn't he? As I pushed open the glass door, a bell jingled overhead, announcing my arrival. Inside, the warmth of the place hit me like a comforting hug. The smell of fried chicken and biscuits made my mouth water, and I could hear the faint hum of a jukebox playing something soft and nostalgic. The room went quiet when they saw me, the chatter dimming as heads turned. "Evening," I said, tipping my hat to no one in particular. I wasn't here to cause trouble. I just wanted a meal. A young man, probably in his 20s, came from behind the counter. His sharp jawline and slicked back hair gave him the air of someone who thought he owned the place. Turns out, he did, or at least his daddy did. His eyes narrowed the moment they landed on me. "We don't serve your kind here," he said, his voice low but firm. The room stayed silent, and the other patrons averted their gazes, like they didn't want to get involved. I felt my fists clench. Memories of the battlefield flashed through my mind, the times I'd fought for these very people, risked my life so they could sit in diners like this without fear. I took a deep breath. "I'm not looking for trouble," I said evenly. "Just something to eat." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. I felt every pair of eyes on me, yet no one spoke up. It wasn't the first time I'd encountered this kind of treatment, and I doubted it would be the last. Still, something about the boy's tone struck a nerve. He wasn't just trying to enforce some unwritten rule. He wanted to humiliate me. I straightened up, keeping my voice calm but firm. "I fought for this country, same as your daddy, maybe even more. I have the right to be here," the young man sneered, stepping closer, his shoulders puffed up like a rooster in a fight. "Don't start preaching to me. I don't care what you did in the war. Around here, we don't serve, Ben." A sharp voice cut through the air, and the boy froze mid-sentence. An older woman in an apron came rushing out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. Her face was lined with years of hard work, but her eyes were sharp, darting between me and the boy. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone brisk. "He was just leaving," Ben replied, his jaw tightening. "I'm not leaving," I said, my voice steady. "All I want is a meal." "I don't think that's too much to ask." The woman gave Ben a pointed look. "Go to the back now." "But Ma, now," she snapped, her voice leaving no room for argument. With one last glare in my direction, Ben stomped off toward the kitchen, muttering under his breath. She turned to me, her expression softening slightly, though there was still caution in her eyes. "I'm sorry about my son," she said. "He doesn't understand." "Well, he doesn't understand a lot of things. You can sit if you'd like." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave, to avoid more trouble, but my pride wouldn't let me back down. I nodded and took a seat at a booth near the window. The other diners slowly returned to their meals, though the air was still charged with unease. The waitress came over, an older woman with kind eyes. "What can I get for you, Han?" she asked, her voice almost apologetic. "Just a plate of whatever's hot," I said, glancing at the menu briefly before sliding it back to her. As I waited for my food, my thoughts drifted back to the war. The faces of my unit came rushing back, faces I hadn't seen in years. I thought of the nights we spent huddled in foxholes, the deafening sound of gunfire, and the bond we'd formed that went beyond race, beyond rank. In those trenches, we were brothers. One face stood out among the rest, Tom Harper. He was a weary man from some small town in Georgia, quick with a joke, but even quicker with his rifle. We'd been through hell together, And when an ambush left him bleeding out in the middle of no man's land, it was me who crawled through the mud to drag him back to safety. I'd stayed by his side until the medics came, even when I could have been killed myself. My thoughts were interrupted when Ben stormed back into the dining area, his face red with anger. "You need to leave," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Ben," his mother snapped from behind the counter. "No, Ma," he shouted back. "I'm not letting him sit here like he owns the place." I stood up slowly, keeping my hands at my sides. I wasn't about to fight the boy, but I wasn't going to be bullied either. "I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I just want to eat." Ben's fists clenched at his sides, and for a moment I thought he might actually take a swing at me. But before he could do anything, the front door swung open, and in walked a man I hadn't seen in years. He was older now, with gray streaks in his hair and deep lines etched into his face, but I recognized him immediately. Tom Harper. The room went silent again as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the diner before landing on me. For a moment, he looked confused, like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Then his face broke into a wide grin. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice booming. "Is that you, Jackson?" The diner seemed frozen in time as Tom Harper's voice echoed through the room. He strode toward me with a slight limp, a reminder of the shrapnel wound he'd taken in the war. His grin was genuine, his eyes lighting up with recognition as he reached out a hand. "Tom," I said, shaking his hand firmly, though I couldn't hide my surprise. "It's been a long time." "It sure has," he replied, his voice carrying a warmth that contrasted sharply with the tension hanging in the air moments before. He looked me over, his smile faltering slightly. "I didn't expect to see you here. What brings you to town?" "Just passing through," I said, glancing toward the counter where Ben stood, his face twisted with confusion and frustration. "Thought I'd grab a bite to eat." Tom's gaze followed mine, and the realization seemed to hit him all at once. His expression darkened as he turned toward the boy. "Ben," he said sharply, his tone suddenly authoritative. "What in God's name are you doing?" Ben stammered, clearly caught off guard. I was just trying to." "You are trying to what?" Tom interrupted, his voice rising. "Throw out the man who saved my life. Do you have any idea who this is?" The silence in the diner was palpable. Every pair of eyes was now fixed on Tom and Ben, the air crackling with anticipation. Ben's face turned red, a mix of anger and humiliation. "I didn't know," he muttered, looking down at the floor. "You didn't know?" Tom repeated, incredulous. "Maybe if you spent less time judging people and more time listening, you'd learn a thing or two." Tom turned back to me, his expression softening again. "I'm sorry about this, Jackson. If I'd known you were here, I'd have come down sooner. It's not your fault," I said, though I couldn't keep the edge out of my voice. "This kind of thing happens more often than it should." Tom nodded grimly. "I know it does. But not in my diner." He turned to the room at large, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "Let me make one thing clear. This man is welcome here anytime. In fact, he's more welcome than most of you. If anyone's got a problem with that, you can see yourself out." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one dared to argue. Slowly, the diners returned to their meals, though the atmosphere remained charged. Ben, however, wasn't ready to let it go. "Why does he matter so much to you?" he asked, his voice tight with defiance. "He's just some guy." Tom's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might lose his temper. But when he spoke, his voice was steady and full of conviction. "He's not just some guy, Ben. He's the reason you still have a father. During the war, I got hit bad, thought I wasn't going to make it. Everyone else was too scared to come for me, but Jackson here didn't hesitate. He risked his life to pull me out of there, and he saved me." Ben blinked, clearly struggling to process this information. I didn't know," he said again, his voice quieter this time. "That's the problem, son," Tom replied. "You don't know because you don't bother to look past your own nose. You think you're better than people because of the color of their skin. Let me tell you something. Out there, in the middle of a battlefield. The only color that matters is red. Tom's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I could see the other patrons stealing glances at me, their expressions a mix of guilt and unease. It wasn't the first time I'd been made to feel like I didn't belong, but it was the first time someone had stood up for me so publicly. Ben looked like he wanted to say something, but instead, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the diner, slamming the kitchen door behind him. Tom sighed, shaking his head. "That boy's got a lot of growing up to do," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. I took a deep breath, finally allowing myself to relax a little. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "Yes, I did," Tom replied firmly. "You deserve better than this, Jackson." "Hell, we all do." The waitress returned with my plate of food, setting it down in front of me with a small, apologetic smile. "Here you go, hon. It's on the house." I nodded my thanks and took a bite. The food was good, comforting in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Tom slid into the booth across from me, his expression thoughtful. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he asked. "More than most," I admitted. "Well," he said, leaning back, "you're not alone anymore. At least not in here." The atmosphere in the diner slowly returned to normal, but a tension lingered in the corners of the room. Tom sat across from me, his eyes heavy with thoughts. He wasn't a man who seemed to enjoy silence, and after a few moments, he spoke again. "You know, Jackson, seeing you here is like a damn miracle," Tom said, his voice low enough to keep the conversation private. "I thought about you a lot after the war, wondered what happened to you. Never thought I'd run into you in my own diner." "I kept a low profile," I replied, sipping from the glass of water the waitress had brought. "Wasn't much of a homecoming waiting for me when I got back. Figured I'd just keep moving." Tom nodded, his expression tightening. "That's a damn shame. You deserved better, still do." Before I could respond, the bell above the diner door jingled again, and an older man stepped inside. He was tall, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore a battered hat and a coat that looked a little too nice for a town like this. The moment he saw me, his eyes narrowed. Then he glanced at Tom, and his expression shifted, like he'd just put together a puzzle piece that didn't sit right with him. "Tom," the man said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "What's going on here?" "Sheriff Hayes," Tom replied, standing up and extending a hand. "Didn't expect to see you tonight." "I heard there was some trouble," the sheriff said, his eyes flicking back to me. "Figured I'd stop by and make sure everything's in order. No trouble here," Tom said, his tone firm. "Just an old friend stopping by for a meal." The sheriff raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. He stepped closer to the booth, his gaze now fully locked on me. "You new in town?" "Just passing through," I said evenly. "Aha," the sheriff replied, his tone flat. "Well, we don't usually get visitors this time of year. Where are you headed?" "Wherever the road takes me," I said, keeping my voice calm. I dealt with men like him before, men who thought their badge gave them the right to look down on anyone they didn't like. The sheriff leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "You might want to think about moving on sooner rather than later, Sheriff," Tom said, stepping between us. "Jackson's not a stranger. He's a veteran, same as me. In fact, he's the reason I'm standing here today." The sheriff's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But then he stepped back, tipping his hat. "Well, I suppose that's your business," he said, though his tone made it clear he wasn't happy about it. "Just make sure everything stays quiet." With that, he turned and left, the bell jingling behind him. Tom let out a heavy sigh, sitting back down across from me. "Sorry about that," he said. "Hayes thinks he owns this town." "Seems like a lot of people around here do," I replied. Tom chuckled dryly, but there was no humor in it. "You're not wrong. This place, it's not what it used to be. Folks around here got meaner after the war, not better." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. The war had changed everyone, but for men like me, coming home had been its own kind of battle. Tom hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Listen, Jackson," he said, his voice low. "There's something you should know. My family's got some history in this town, history I'm not proud of. My daddy built this diner back in the 30s, but he wasn't exactly a saint. He ran with the wrong crowd, believed in the wrong things. I've spent my whole life trying to fix what he broke, but some people around here still think of me as his son first and a man second. I frowned, not entirely sure where he was going with this. What's that got to do with me? Tom glanced around the room, as if making sure no one was listening. Ben's got a lot of my daddy in him, he admitted. I've tried to set him straight, but he's stubborn. Gets it from his mother's side, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. Point is, he's not just mad at you for being here. He's mad at me for what I've been trying to do with this place. I want this diner to be a place where everyone's welcome, no matter who they are. But not everyone agrees. It clicked then why Ben had been so hostile, why the sheriff had shown up so quickly. This wasn't just about me. It was about a deeper fight happening in this town, one that Tom had been waging long before I walked through the door. Before I could respond, the kitchen door swung open, and Ben stepped out again. He looked different, less angry, more uncertain. He walked up to the booth, glancing between me and his father. I didn't know, he said quietly, his eyes on me. About the war. About what you did. I studied him for a moment, trying to gauge if he was sincere. What you didn't know doesn't change what you did, I said, my tone even. But you've got a chance to do better. Ben stood there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, shoulders slumped. For a moment, he looked like a child who had just been scolded, his bravado stripped away. His apology, though halting and incomplete, hung in the air, waiting for acknowledgement. Tom spoke first, his voice measured but firm. It's a start, Ben, but words mean nothing if they aren't followed by action. Ben's eyes flickered to his father, then back to me. I'm sorry, he repeated, more forcefully this time. I didn't know who you were, what you'd done. He trailed off, frustration twisting his features. I've been taught to think a certain way, and maybe that's not right. It's not about me, I said, leaning forward slightly. It's about how you treat people, anyone who walks through that door. Doesn't matter if they're a stranger or someone you've known your whole life. Respect doesn't come with conditions. Ben nodded, though his expression remained conflicted. He seemed to be wrestling with the weight of everything that had just been revealed, the truth about his father, his own actions, and the expectations placed on him. I'll do better, he said, almost to himself. We'll see, Tom said, his voice carrying a note of finality. It's not about promises, son. It's about choices. As Ben returned to the kitchen, Tom let out a long breath, as if a weight he'd been carrying had grown heavier. He looked back at me, his eyes apologetic. I can't undo what he's done, Jackson, but I hope you'll give me a chance to make this right. I'm not here for revenge, Tom, I said. I just wanted a meal and a little peace. But maybe your boy learned something tonight. Tom nodded, his expression thoughtful. I hope so. God knows I've tried to teach him. But this town, this place makes it hard for people to change. I sipped my water, my thoughts swirling. The quiet racism and hostility of places like this weren't new to me, but seeing Tom's fight against it sparked a strange mix of anger and admiration. I'd fought battles on foreign soil, but Tom was fighting a war right here at home, a war that, in some ways, was even harder to win. The door to the diner jingled again, and I instinctively turned to see who had entered. This time, it was a young woman, her face pale and her hair tucked under a knitted hat. She hesitated in the doorway, her eyes darting nervously around the room before she spotted Tom. Mr. Harper, she said, her voice trembling, you need to come outside. It's about Ben. Tom shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. What happened? The girl looked over her shoulder, as if afraid someone was following her. It's Hayes. He's got Ben out back. He says Ben needs to answer for what happened tonight. Tom's face darkened, and without another word, he marched toward the door. I followed instinctively, sensing that whatever was happening wasn't going to end well. The other patrons watched us leave, their murmurs filling the silence as we stepped into the cold night air. Behind the diner, under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, Sheriff Hayes stood with his arms crossed, his stance menacing. Ben was there too, his back against the wall, his face pale but defiant. Two other men stood nearby, their postures casual but threatening. "This ain't your business, Tom," Hayes said, his voice dripping with authority. "Your boy needs to learn a lesson from you." Tom shot back, his voice sharp. "Since when is roughing up kids part of your job, Sheriff?" Hayes smirked, clearly unbothered. "This isn't about the boy. It's about what you're trying to do with this place. Some folks don't like it, and they think maybe it's time you're reminded of where you stand." I stepped forward before I could stop myself, the cold air biting at my skin. "You're not talking to a man who's going to back down," I said, my voice steady. "And if you're thinking about teaching someone a lesson, maybe you should start with yourself." Hayes turned to me, his eyes narrowing. "You've got a big mouth for a stranger. Maybe you don't know how things work around here." "I know enough," I replied, "and I've dealt with bullies before." "You're no different." The tension was electric, the air crackling with the unspoken threat of violence. Tom stepped forward, placing himself between Hayes and his son. "This stops now," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "You don't scare me, Hayes, and you won't scare off Jackson either. If you've got a problem, take it up with me." For a moment, Hayes seemed to consider his options, his gaze flicking between me, Tom, and the boy. Finally, he sneered and motioned for his men to back off. "You're playing a dangerous game, Tom," he said. "Don't think this is over." As Hayes and his men disappeared into the night, Tom let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging with relief. Ben looked at his father, his expression a mix of fear and newfound respect. "Thanks," Ben muttered, his voice barely audible. Tom nodded but said nothing, his gaze fixed on the darkness where Hayes had vanished. I could see the weight of the moment in his eyes, the realization that the fight was far from over. The diner lights glowed warmly behind us, a stark contrast to the icy tension that lingered in the alley. Tom stood silently for a moment, his breaths visible in the cold air, before finally turning to Ben. "You all right?" he asked, his voice soft but tinged with frustration. Ben nodded slowly, still shaken, but steady enough to stand tall. "Yeah. I didn't think Hayes would go that far." Tom frowned, the lines on his face deepening. "You've got a lot to learn, son. That man's been waiting for an excuse to pull something like this for years. Don't give him another one." Ben looked down, his shame evident, and Tom let out a weary sigh. "Go inside. Help your mother clean up." Ben hesitated, glancing at me as if he wanted to say something, but he seemed to think better of it. With a nod, he turned and disappeared back into the diner. Once he was gone, Tom rubbed the back of his neck, his shoulders sagging. "I owe you one, Jackson. If you hadn't stepped in back there." "Don't mention it," I said, leaning against the wall. "I've seen men like Hayes before. They push as far as they're allowed, but they always fold when someone stands up to them." Tom gave a bitter chuckle. "You're right about that. Problem is, Hayes has the town wrapped around his finger. Most folks here are too scared to cross him." "Why does he care so much about your diner?" I asked. "Seems like there's more to this than just me showing up." Tom hesitated, his expression clouding with something I couldn't quite place. "It's not just the diner," he admitted. "It's what it represents. My father ran this place with a different set of rules, ones Hayes and his kind approved of. I've spent years trying to change that, to make this a place where everyone's welcome. But not everyone's ready for change." He paused, then glanced back at the diner. "I've had threats before, subtle ones, anonymous letters, slashed tires, that sort of thing. Tonight, though, that was different. Hayes came here with a purpose." I folded my arms, the pieces starting to come together. "He doesn't just want to intimidate you. He wants to shut you down." Tom nodded grimly. "Exactly. This diner's the only place in town where people like you can walk in and sit down without being turned away. That doesn't sit well with some folks, especially not Hayes." The weight of his words hung between us, heavy and undeniable. I'd seen battles fought for all kinds of reasons, but this was something deeper, a fight for dignity, for a chance to simply exist without fear. And it wasn't just Tom's fight. It was mine too, whether I wanted it or not. "You're not going to give up, are you?" I asked. Tom's eyes flashed with determination. "Not a chance. My father might have built this place, but I'm the one who's going to decide what it stands for." His resolve was admirable, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. Running a business was hard enough without a town sheriff and his goons breathing down your neck. He was fighting a war with no clear end in sight. "Then you're going to need help," I said. Tom raised an eyebrow. "You offering?" "Seems like I'm already in the middle of it," I replied with a faint smile. "Might as well stick around and see it through." Tom laughed, a sound that was equal parts relief and gratitude. "I won't say no to that. But I've got to warn you, things might get uglier before they get better. Wouldn't be the first time," I said, the memory of old battles flickering in my mind. As we walked back inside, the warmth of the diner was a welcome contrast to the cold outside. The patrons had thinned out, leaving only a few stragglers sipping coffee and chatting quietly. Ben was at the counter, scrubbing dishes with a determination I hadn't seen before. His mother gave us a cautious glance as we entered, her eyes lingering on Tom. "What happened?" she asked, her voice low. "Hayes paid us a visit," Tom said. "But it's handled, for now." Her face tightened, worry etched into every line. "Tom, this is getting out of hand. What if he comes back? What if next time he doesn't just threaten?" Tom placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll handle it, Ruth. We've come this far. We're not turning back now." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded, her gaze shifting to me. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing up for us." "It's not just for you," I said. "This fight's bigger than any one person." Ruth gave a small, sad smile, then returned to her work. I sat back down at the booth, my mind racing. Tom's battle wasn't just about the diner. It was about challenging the very foundation of this town's prejudice. And whether I liked it or not, I was now part of that fight. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the promise of more storms to come. The night wore on, and the diner gradually emptied, the last few customers leaving behind only the sound of Ruth's clinking dishes in the sink. Tom sat across from me again, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. He looked tired but resolute, a man carrying the weight of a fight he'd never asked for but refused to abandon. "You ever feel like you're trying to move a mountain with a spoon?" Tom asked suddenly, his voice low. "Every day," I replied. "But sometimes the mountain moves an inch. That's enough to keep going." Tom nodded thoughtfully, his fingers drumming against the mug. "I've had my doubts, Jackson, about whether this is all worth it. My father, he built this place for people like Hayes, the kind who wanted to keep things the way they've always been. When I came back from the war, I told myself I wasn't going to let his legacy define me. But some days, it feels like I'm just patching leaks in a sinking ship." I studied him for a moment, trying to decide how honest to be. "You're not just fighting for a diner, Tom. You're fighting for what it represents. And that scares people like Hayes. It means you're doing something right." Tom let out a bitter laugh. "Right doesn't always pay the bills. Especially when half the town avoids this place, because they think I'm some kind of traitor." "Traitor?" I raised an eyebrow. "For what? Treating people like human beings." "That's the way they see it," Tom said, shaking his head. "My father was a pillar of this community, and they expect me to follow in his footsteps." I didn't realize how deep his shadow ran until I tried to step out of it. I leaned back in my seat, letting his words sink in. The fight Tom was waging wasn't just about racism. It was about defying the expectations of an entire town, a town that seemed determined to hold on to its past, no matter the cost. Before I could respond, Ruth came over, drying her hands on a towel. "You two look like you're solving the world's problems over here," she said with a tired smile. "Just trying to figure out how to keep this place standing," Tom replied. Ruth hesitated, her smile fading. "Tom, maybe it's time to think about letting it go." "What?" Tom's voice was sharp, his eyes narrowing. "You've done everything you can," Ruth said gently. "But this place, what it stands for, it's put a target on our backs. On Ben's back. Maybe it's time to let it go before someone gets hurt." Tom stared at her, his jaw tightening. "You think giving up is going to change anything? You think Hayes and his kind will stop if we close the doors? They'll see it as a victory, Ruth, and they'll keep going. And if we keep fighting, what happens to Ben? To us?" Ruth's voice cracked, her worry spilling over. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's reality. The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on all of us. I could see the conflict in Tom's eyes, the pull between his principles and his family. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Ben emerged from the kitchen. "Don't close it," Ben said quietly. He stood in the doorway, his expression serious. "We can't let them win." Ruth turned to him, her face a mix of surprise and concern. "Ben, you don't understand." "No, I do," Ben interrupted, his voice firm. "I've been a jerk. I've said things and done things that I'm not proud of. But tonight, I saw what Hayes is really like. And I saw what Dad's been trying to do. This place, it's more than just a diner. It's proof that people can be better." Tom's expression softened, pride and uncertainty warring in his eyes. "You really believe that, son?" Ben nodded. "Yeah, and I want to help. I don't know how, but I'll figure it out." Ruth looked at both of them, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "This isn't just about us. It's about you, Ben. Your future." Ben stepped closer, his voice steady. "Then let me help shape it. I don't want to run away. I want to stand and fight." Tom looked at me, his expression unreadable. "What do you think, Jackson? Am I crazy for believing we can change this place?" I met his gaze, my own resolve hardening. "Change doesn't come easy, Tom, but it starts with people like you, like us." Ruth sighed, her shoulders sagging in resignation. "All right," she said softly, "but if we're going to fight, we need to be smart about it." Tom nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Then let's start planning." As the four of us sat down to map out our next steps, I felt something shift, a small but significant change in the air. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me that even the smallest sparks could ignite a fire. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the warmth of determination burned brighter than ever. The diner was eerily quiet as we sat around the table, a plan forming in bits and pieces. Ruth brought over a fresh pot of coffee, her movements quick but methodical, as if pouring the steaming liquid into our mugs might steady her trembling hands. Outside, the wind continued to whistle through the cracks of the old building, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. Tom leaned back in his chair, staring at a crude map of the town we'd drawn on a napkin. "If Hayes wants to push us out, we need to make it harder for him to pull the strings," he said. "He uses fear to keep people in line. We've got to show them that standing up to him is worth it." "But how do we do that?" Ben asked, his brows furrowed. "Most people around here don't even want to be seen with us, let alone stand against Hayes." Tom tapped his pen against the table, his frustration simmering just below the surface. "We don't need everyone. Just a few allies, people willing to speak out, to put pressure on him." I sipped my coffee, the bitterness grounding me. "What about the mayor? He must have some influence." Tom let out a humorless laugh. "The mayor's in Hayes's pocket. Always has been. Anyone with real power in this town either works for Hayes or owes him favors." "What about the newspapers?" I suggested. "If we can get the story out, show people what's really happening here, maybe we can build some outside pressure." Tom considered this, his eyes narrowing. "There's a paper in the next town over. The editor's a decent guy, doesn't have much love for Hayes. It's risky, though. If Hayes finds out we're going to the press, he'll double down," Ruth finished, her voice heavy. "And he'll make sure we're the ones who pay the price." Before Tom could respond, the front door swung open, the bell jangling loudly in the stillness. We all turned, our nerves on edge, but it was only the young waitress from earlier. She hesitated in the doorway, her face pale and her arms clutching a small bundle of papers. "Mary," Ruth said, rising to meet her. "What are you doing back here so late?" Mary glanced around nervously, her eyes lingering on the windows as if she expected someone to burst through at any moment. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found something I think you need to see." She placed the bundle on the table, and as Tom unfolded it, I saw it was a stack of ledgers and receipts, some stained and crumpled from age. His brow furrowed as he scanned the pages, flipping through them with increasing urgency. "Where did you get this?" Tom asked, his tone sharp. From the courthouse, Mary said, twisting her hands together. I was filing records for Hayes, part of my job as the clerk, and I noticed something strange. These payments, they don't make sense. They're to companies that don't exist, for services that were never provided. Ruth stepped closer, her hand resting on Tom's shoulder as she peered at the documents. What are you saying? Mary swallowed hard. I'm saying Hayes has been skimming money from the town for years. These ledgers prove it. If this gets out, Tom let out a low whistle, a mixture of astonishment and grim satisfaction. It could bring him down. I leaned in, examining the papers. Mary was right. The entries were blatantly fraudulent, with large sums of money disappearing into thin air. It wasn't just theft. It was systemic corruption, the kind that could topple not just Hayes, but anyone tied to him. This is dangerous, I said, meeting Mary's wide eyes. If Hayes finds out you have this. I know, she said, her voice trembling, but I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. You've been fighting him for years, Mr. Harper. This might be the only chance to stop him for good. Tom looked at Mary, a mixture of gratitude and concern etched into his face. You're brave, Mary. Braver than most. But this changes everything. If Hayes catches wind of this, he won't just come after me. He'll come after all of us. What do we do? Ben asked, his voice cracking with tension. Tom took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room. First, we make copies of these documents. We need to get them to the editor in the next town, but we can't be careless. Hayes has ears everywhere. And what about Mary? Ruth asked, her voice tight with worry. She's not safe if she goes back to work. Mary shook her head. I'll be fine. I'll keep my head down, act like nothing's changed. But you have to promise me if this goes bad, you'll make sure these get out. You have my word, Tom said firmly. The room fell silent as we all stared at the damning papers, the weight of what they represented pressing down on us. This wasn't just about the diner anymore. It was about exposing the rot at the heart of the town, about standing up to a man who had ruled through fear for far too long. Outside, a car engine rumbled to life, its headlights briefly illuminating the windows. My chest tightened as I watched the shadows pass, a reminder that every move we made from here on out would be under scrutiny. The fight had just escalated, and there was no turning back. The diner felt like a pressure cooker, the weight of what Mary had brought bearing down on everyone. Tom leaned heavily against the counter, his fingers drumming against the ledgers as if willing them to reveal the next step. Ruth moved about the kitchen, her usual efficiency muted by a distracted air. Ben sat quietly, his face pale and serious. For once, the usual defiance in his eyes was replaced by something else, determination, maybe even guilt. Mary lingered near the door, her nervous energy palpable. I could tell she wanted to leave, to escape the storm brewing around her, but something kept her rooted in place. I decided to break the silence. Mary, I said gently, drawing her attention. What made you do it? Taking those papers wasn't a small risk. She hesitated, glancing at the others before answering. I've worked for Hayes since I was 16, she said, her voice low. I grew up thinking he was this pillar of the community, someone who kept the town running. But over the years, I started seeing cracks. The way he talked about people who weren't like him, the way he treated his staff. Then I saw the books. At first, I told myself it wasn't my business. But her voice faltered, and she looked at Tom. Your diner was the first place I felt like things could be different, like someone was actually standing up to him. I guess I just couldn't ignore it anymore. Tom nodded, his expression softening. It takes guts to do what you did. I don't know if I'd have had the courage in your shoes. Mary smiled faintly, but her eyes were shadowed with fear. I just hope it's worth it. It will be, I said firmly, though even I wasn't entirely sure. But we've got to be smart about this. Tom straightened, his resolve hardening again. We need a plan. First, we make copies of these papers and get them to the editor in the next town. Jackson, you've got military training. Can you help us figure out how to get them out without tipping Hayes off? I nodded. We'll need to be discreet. No phones, no public places. We'll deliver them in person, but not all at once. If Hayes catches wind of this, he'll do everything he can to shut it down. Ruth emerged from the kitchen, her arms crossed. What about Mary? If Hayes realizes she's missing these files, she won't be safe. Mary shook her head quickly. I'll go back to work like nothing's happened. He won't know I was here. Are you sure? Ruth asked, her tone skeptical. He's not a fool, Mary. No, but he's arrogant. Mary replied. He thinks he's untouchable. If I keep my head down, he won't suspect me. Tom exchanged a glance with me, his worry clear. It's risky, he said, but it might be our best shot. Ben, who had been silent until now, spoke up. What about the people in town? There's got to be someone else who's tired of Hayes. Someone who'll stand with us. Tom sighed, rubbing his temples. There are a few folks who've spoken up here and there, but they've always backed down when things got tough. Hayes knows how to scare people into silence. What if we gave them something to believe in? Ben asked, his voice earnest. If we showed them these papers proved Hayes is a crook, they might finally stand up. It's not that simple, Ruth said, her tone weary. Fear doesn't just disappear because you hand someone a piece of paper. Maybe not, I said, looking at Ben. But he's right about one thing. If we want to win, we need more than just us. We need allies. Tom nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. There's a pastor over at the Baptist church on the edge of town, Reverend Collins. He's always been vocal about equality, even when it cost him some of his congregation. If anyone's willing to help, it's him. Then we start there, I said. But we can't bring him into this blind. We'll show him the papers and let him decide how involved he wants to be. Mary looked relieved to have a plan forming, but I could see the worry still etched on her face. What if Hayes comes after the Reverend? She asked. That's his choice to make, Tom said grimly. But if I know Collins, he won't back down. He's been waiting for a chance to take Hayes on. Then it's settled, I said. We copy the papers, deliver them to the editor, and loop in Reverend Collins. But we move fast. The longer we wait, the more time Hayes has to find out what we're doing. Tom stood and stretched, his determination renewed. All right, I'll take care of the copies first thing in the morning. I'll go with you, I said. 2 sets of eyes are better than one. Ruth placed a hand on Tom's arm. Be careful, she said softly. If anything happens, nothing will, Tom assured her, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. As we dispersed to prepare for the next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on borrowed time. The fight was escalating, and Hayes wouldn't sit idle for long. Whatever came next, we'd need every ounce of courage we could muster. The next morning, the tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. Tom and I set out early, the streets of the town unusually quiet. The diner was left in Ruth's capable hands, with Mary covering the counter to maintain the appearance of business as usual. Ben stayed close to his mother, a quiet but steady presence as they prepared for the inevitable. Tom drove his battered pickup truck, the engine sputtering as we made our way toward the next town. The papers were tucked securely in a manila envelope under my arm. I glanced out the window, the barren fields rushing past, but my mind was focused on the task ahead. You ever get that feeling? Tom asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Like you're being watched? I tensed, scanning the road behind us. A black sedan followed at a distance, its dark windows glinting in the morning sun. It wasn't uncommon for someone to be heading out this way, but something about the way it lingered in the periphery made my gut tighten. I see it, I said, keeping my voice steady. Don't look back again. Let's see if they make a move. Tom nodded, his knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. The truck rattled as he accelerated slightly, but the sedan maintained its distance. The miles stretched on, each one heavier than the last, until finally Tom spoke again. You think it's him? He asked. It's someone, I replied. And if they're following us, it means they know more than we'd like. Tom's jaw tightened. We can't lead them to the editor. We won't, I said, formulating a plan as the sedan edged closer. Turn off at the next junction. Let's see if they take the bait. Tom nodded, his face pale but determined. As we approached the turn, he flicked on the signal, the truck groaning as it veered onto a narrow dirt road. The sedan followed without hesitation, its engine revving as it drew closer. My instincts screamed that trouble was coming. "Pull over," I said, "but stay in the truck. Let me handle this." Tom hesitated, then nodded, easing the truck onto the shoulder. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots, and stood in the middle of the road as the sedan rolled to a stop a few yards away. The driver's door opened, and a man in a dark coat stepped out, his expression blank but his posture tense. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice casual. "Something I can help you with?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached inside his coat, and I felt my pulse spike. I didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. "Hey," I barked, my voice sharp enough to make him pause. "Think real hard about your next move." His hand froze, then slowly withdrew a cigarette instead of a weapon. He lit it, his eyes never leaving mine. "Just out for a drive," he said finally, his voice calm but laced with menace. "You boys seem like you're in a hurry. Funny coincidence," I replied, keeping my stance relaxed but ready. "Nice day for a drive," he smirked, taking a long drag. "Nice day for a lot of things." Behind me, I heard the truck door creak open. Tom stepped out, his expression hard. "Whatever you're doing, you better think twice about it," he said, his voice steady despite the tension. The man exhaled a plume of smoke, his smirk widening. "Just delivering a message," he said. "Hayes doesn't like loose ends. You boys might want to reconsider your trip." "That sounds like a threat," I said, my voice low. "It's advice," the man replied, flicking his cigarette onto the ground. "Smart folks take it." He turned and got back into the sedan, the engine roaring as he sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. I waited until the car disappeared over the horizon before turning to Tom. "You all right?" I asked. Tom nodded, though his face was pale. "That was Hayes's man, wasn't it?" "Yeah," I said grimly. "And he knows what we're up to." Tom swore under his breath, kicking at the gravel. "If he knows, then Hayes does too. That means Mary's in danger. Ruth, Ben, everyone." I placed a hand on his shoulder, forcing him to meet my gaze. "That's why we need to keep moving. The only way to protect them is to finish what we started." Tom took a deep breath, steadying himself. "You're right. Let's get to the editor." The rest of the drive was tense, but uneventful. When we finally reached the small, unassuming office of the Tribune, Tom parked the truck around the back, out of sight. We approached the editor cautiously, explaining the situation and handing over the papers. The editor, a weary man named Sam Owens, whistled low as he flipped through the documents. "This is dynamite," he said, his eyes wide. "If this gets out, Hayes is finished." "That's the idea," Tom said, his voice firm. "But we need to move fast." "Hayes already knows something's up." Sam nodded, pulling out a camera to start photographing the evidence. "Don't worry. By tomorrow morning, this story will be everywhere." Tom and I exchanged a glance, the weight of the moment sinking in. The first strike had been made, but the war was far from over. We knew Hayes wouldn't go down without a fight, and the fight was coming straight for us. The ride back to town was silent, the tension in the cab of the truck as heavy as the leaden sky above. Tom gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, while I kept my eyes on the road behind us, half expecting the black sedan to reappear. It didn't, but the absence of pursuit didn't ease my mind. Hayes's warning wasn't just words, it was a promise. When we finally pulled into the diner's gravel lot, Ruth was waiting at the door, her arms crossed and her face pale. Ben stood behind her, his eyes wide with worry. As soon as we stepped out of the truck, she hurried over. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight. Tom glanced at me, then back at her. "Hayes knows," he said simply. Ruth's face crumpled, fear flickering across her features. "What does that mean? Is he coming here?" "Maybe," I said, stepping closer. "But he won't act immediately. He'll want to see how much we've done and how far we're willing to go. That gives us time to prepare." "Prepare for what?" Ben asked, his voice cracking. "This isn't a battlefield." "No," I said firmly, "but the principles are the same. Hayes thrives on fear and control. If we can take that away from him, we have a chance." Ruth shook her head, her voice trembling. "And if we can't, what happens then?" Tom stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We've come too far to back down now, Ruth. If we stop, Hayes wins. And the next time someone tries to stand up to him, they won't just face threats. They'll face him emboldened." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, her jaw tightening. "All right," she said. "What do we do?" Tom and I spent the rest of the evening hammering out a plan. The first step was to secure the diner. We locked every door and window, reinforced the back entrance with a heavy plank, and turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of a single lamp in the kitchen. Ruth and Mary stayed inside with Ben, while Tom and I took turns keeping watch from the roof. The night stretched on, cold and quiet. Around midnight, Tom joined me on the roof, a rifle slung over his shoulder. "This takes me back," he said, his breath visible in the frosty air. "Sitting in the dark, waiting for something to happen. Difference is, this time, the enemy isn't in uniform," I said, scanning the empty street. "And we don't know when or where they'll strike." Tom sighed, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "You think we'll see them tonight?" "Doubt it," I said. "Hayes will want us on edge first. He's playing a psychological game, as if on cue." A loud crash echoed from the back of the diner. Tom and I scrambled down the ladder, our boots hitting the ground just as Ben burst through the back door. "Someone threw a brick through the window," he shouted. We rushed inside to find Ruth and Mary standing in the dining area, both visibly shaken. The front window was shattered, shards of glass littering the floor. A brick lay in the center of the room, a piece of paper tied around it with string. Tom bent down, untying the paper and unfolding it. His face darkened as he read the words scrawled in bold, angry letters. "Last chance. Close up and leave, or this gets worse." "Cowards," Ben muttered, his fists clenched. "Why don't they show their faces?" "Because they don't need to," I said. "They think fear will do the job for them." Tom crumpled the note, his jaw tight. "We're not closing." "No," I said, "but we need to be smart. Hayes is escalating, and this won't be the last warning." Ruth stepped forward, her voice shaking but resolute. "What about the papers? Are they safe?" "They're with the editor," Tom said. "He's running the story tomorrow. Once it's out, Hayes will have a lot more to worry about than us." Mary nodded, her hands gripping the counter for support. "Then we just have to hold out until then." As we cleaned up the glass and boarded up the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that Hayes's next move wouldn't be a warning. He'd tested us with fear and found that we wouldn't bend. The next strike would be harder, more direct. By dawn, the diner was quiet again, but none of us had slept. Tom brewed a fresh pot of coffee, his movements slower than usual, the exhaustion evident in his every gesture. Ben sat at the counter, staring out the boarded-up window, his expression grim. "We'll need help," I said finally. "If Hayes comes at us in force, we can't stand alone." Tom nodded. "The Reverend." "Exactly," I said. "We bring him in, and we rally whoever's willing to stand with us." Ben looked over, his voice tentative. "You really think people will show up?" I met his gaze, my own resolve hardening. "They will if we give them a reason." The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the diner. It was quiet too quiet. The boarded-up window and broken glass still scattered across the sidewalk were stark reminders of the night before. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. Ruth and Mary sat at the counter, sipping coffee in silence, while Ben leaned against the doorframe, his gaze distant. Tom emerged from the back room, his shoulders squared despite the weariness in his eyes. "We've got to move," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Reverend Collins needs to know what's happening. If anyone in this town is willing to take a stand, it's him." "I'll go," I offered. "You stay here with your family. If Hayes shows up, you'll need to be here." Tom hesitated, but then he nodded. "All right. The church is on the edge of town, off Miller Road. The Reverend's usually there in the mornings." I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The cold morning air was sharp and bracing, the streets still deserted. I took Tom's truck, the engine sputtering as I headed toward the small church. The ride was tense, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. If Hayes's men were watching, I didn't want to lead them to the Reverend. The church came into view at the end of a quiet lane, its white steeple standing tall against the pale sky. I parked a short distance away, approaching cautiously. The front door was slightly ajar, and as I stepped inside, the faint sound of a piano echoed through the empty sanctuary. "Reverend Collins?" I called out, my voice low but firm. The music stopped, and a moment later, a tall, broad-shouldered man appeared from a side room. His salt and pepper hair framed a face marked by years of both kindness and struggle. He wiped his hands on a cloth and approached, his gaze wary but curious. "I'm Reverend Collins," he said. "And you are?" "Jackson," I replied, extending a hand. "A friend of Tom Harper's. We need your help." At the mention of Tom's name, his expression softened. "Tom's a good man," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "What kind of help does he need?" I quickly explained the situation: the ledgers, Hayes's threats, the article set to publish, and the escalating danger. Collins listened intently, his expression darkening as I laid out the stakes. "This town's been under Hayes's thumb for too long," Collins said, his voice filled with conviction. "But standing up to him openly will put a target on anyone who joins us." "That's already happening," I said. "Tom's diner was attacked last night. Hayes sent a warning. He's not going to stop unless we force his hand." Collins nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "The congregation has seen what Hayes is capable of. Many are afraid to speak out. But if we show them the truth, if we give them proof." He trailed off, his gaze turning thoughtful. "There's a meeting at the church tonight. A few trusted members of the community will be there. We can rally them, start building support. It'll have to be fast," I said. "Once the article goes live, Hayes will come after anyone who stands against him." Collins met my gaze, his eyes steady. "Then we stand together. This fight isn't just about Tom's diner. It's about breaking the cycle of fear in this town." I nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. Collins wasn't just willing to help, he was ready to lead. "I'll let Tom know. We'll be ready." As I left the church, the sense of urgency grew. The town felt like a powder keg, and we were running out of time before the spark hit. When I returned to the diner, Tom was waiting on the porch, his rifle propped against the wall. He looked up as I pulled in, his face a mix of relief and tension. "Collins is in," I said as I climbed out of the truck. "He's calling a meeting tonight. Trusted folks, people who might be willing to stand up." Tom nodded, his jaw tightening. "Good. We'll need them inside." The atmosphere was tense but focused. Ruth and Mary were prepping food, not for customers but for the people who would soon gather at the church. Ben was at the counter, a notebook open in front of him, as he jotted down ideas for rallying support. "What's the plan?" Ben asked as I sat down beside him. "Collins will handle the meeting," I said. "We need to be there to show people what's at stake. Bring the copies of the ledgers and explain what Hayes has done. And if Hayes shows up," Ben's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his worry. "Then we're ready," I said firmly. No more running, no more hiding. As the hours passed, the tension in the diner grew. We double-checked every lock, rehearsed what we would say, and waited for night to fall. When it finally did, the town seemed to hold its breath. The drive to the church was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we arrived, the sanctuary was dimly lit, but a small group of people had already gathered. Collins stood at the front, his presence commanding yet reassuring. As we entered, all eyes turned to us, the weight of expectation heavy in the air. Tom stepped forward, the ledgers in hand, and began to speak. The church was alive with quiet murmurs as Tom stepped to the front, the ledgers in his hand. Reverend Collins stood beside him, his towering presence lending silent support. The small congregation, a mix of nervous townsfolk and a few familiar faces from the diner, watched with cautious curiosity. "Thank you all for coming," Tom began, his voice steady but edged with tension. "I know being here tonight isn't easy. Hayes has kept this town under his thumb for a long time, and showing up here makes you a target. But this isn't just about me, my family, or the diner. This is about all of us." He opened one of the ledgers and held it up. "These papers prove that Hayes has been stealing from the town for years. Taxes, public works funds, you name it, it's all been funneled into his own pockets. While we've struggled to get by, he's been lining his pockets with our hard-earned money. A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. A woman in the back whispered to her neighbor, her hand flying to her mouth. Another man folded his arms, skepticism warring with anger on his face. Tom continued, his voice rising with passion. But this isn't just about money. Hayes uses fear to control us. He intimidates, threatens, and hurts anyone who dares to stand up to him. Last night, he sent one of his men to threaten my family. He threw a brick through my diner window, warning us to leave town. Well, I'm not leaving, and neither should you. The murmurs grew louder, uncertainty mixing with a flicker of hope. Reverend Collins stepped forward, raising a hand to quiet the room. Tom is right, he said, his voice deep and commanding. For too long, Hayes has made us believe we are powerless. He has thrived on our fear and our silence. But tonight, we have a choice. We can continue to let him divide us, or we can unite and take back what is ours. A man in the front row stood, his face lined with worry. What if Hayes finds out about this? He won't just come after Tom. He'll come after all of us. He already knows, I said, stepping forward. He sent a man to follow us earlier today. Hayes knows we're pushing back, and he's scared. That's why he's escalating. He knows his grip on this town is slipping. The room grew still as I let my words sink in. We can't let fear win. Not this time. If we stand together, Hayes loses. But it starts here with us. A moment of silence followed, the weight of the decision pressing down on everyone. Then, one by one, hands began to raise. First, the skeptical man in the corner. Then the woman who had whispered. Soon, nearly everyone in the room had pledged their support. Tom nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Thank you. Together, we can do this. Just as the mood began to shift, the sound of engines roared outside. The room fell silent, tension snapping back into place like a rubber band stretched to its limit. Reverend Collins moved to the window, his face hardening. They're here, he said. Tom exchanged a grim look with me, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. Stay calm, he said to the room. Don't give them a reason to act. The doors to the church slammed open, and Hayes strode in, flanked by 3 of his men. His face was a mask of smug confidence, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease as he scanned the room. Well, he drawled, his voice dripping with mock amusement. Quite the gathering you've got here, Tom. Didn't think you had it in you. Tom stepped forward, his stance firm. This isn't your town, Hayes. Not anymore. Hayes chuckled, but the sound was cold. That's where you're wrong. This town is mine, and you're making a big mistake trying to take it from me. We're not taking anything, Tom said. We're taking back what's ours. Hayes's smirk faded, replaced by a steely glare. You really think you can win this? That these people will stand by you when things get ugly? They already are, Reverend Collins said, stepping beside Tom. You don't scare us any more, Hayes. The tension in the room was electric. Hayes glanced at his men, who shifted uneasily under the watchful eyes of the townsfolk. He looked back at Tom, his sneer returning. You think some papers and a few angry words are going to bring me down? They're already in the hands of the press, I said, my voice cutting through the room. By morning, everyone will know what you've done. For the first time, Hayes faltered. His jaw tightened, and his fists clenched at his sides. You're bluffing. Try us, Tom said, his voice cold and unyielding. You've already lost, Hayes. Walk away before you make it worse for yourself. The room held its collective breath as Hayes stared at Tom, his expression a volatile mix of fury and calculation. Finally, he turned on his heel, his men following him without a word. The doors slammed shut behind them, and the engines roared away into the night. The church erupted into nervous cheers and murmurs. Reverend Collins raised his hands, calming the crowd. This isn't over, he said, his voice steady. But tonight, we took the first step. Together. Tom exhaled, the weight of the confrontation visibly lifting. He looked at me and nodded. We did it. No, I said, glancing at the determined faces around the room. They did. The aftermath of the confrontation lingered in the air as the congregation slowly dispersed. Reverend Collins reassured everyone that they had taken a powerful step forward, but he also warned of the challenges still ahead. People left in pairs or small groups, heads held high, but voices hushed as they moved into the cold night. Tom stood near the front of the sanctuary, his rifle propped against a pew. He was talking quietly with Ruth, who had arrived with Ben just after Hayes left. Mary hovered nearby, her nervous energy still evident, but a small smile hinted at relief. I sat at the back of the church, letting the tension in my body ease as the reality of what we had just done began to sink in. Reverend Collins walked over, his large frame blocking the flickering light of a nearby candle. "Jackson," he said, sitting beside me, "thank you for what you did tonight. You've given these people something they've been missing for a long time, hope." I nodded, running a hand over my face. "It's not over yet. Hayes isn't going to take this lying down." Collins smiled faintly, his gaze steady. "He may try, but tonight he saw something he wasn't expecting: unity. That's the one thing he can't control." The Reverend's words were reassuring, but I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. Hayes had retreated, but he wasn't beaten. Men like him didn't crumble overnight. He'd come back, and when he did, he'd be more dangerous than ever. Tom approached, his expression a mix of relief and weariness. "We're heading back to the diner," he said. "You coming?" "Yeah," I said, standing. "Let's get some rest while we can." The ride back to the diner was quiet, the tension from earlier replaced by an exhausted calm. When we arrived, Ruth insisted on making a late supper, her way of grounding herself after the chaos. We sat around the counter, sharing a meal that tasted better than it had any right to, given the circumstances. For a moment, it felt almost normal, like the weight of the last few days had lifted. But the normalcy didn't last. Just after midnight, the phone in the diner rang. Tom answered, his expression darkening as he listened. When he hung up, his face was pale, his jaw tight. "That was Sam Owens," he said, his voice low. "The editor. What happened?" I asked, already bracing for bad news. "The paper's printing the story as we speak," Tom said. "But Hayes's men paid Sam a visit tonight. Tried to intimidate him into pulling it. Did he cave?" Ben asked, his voice wavering. Tom shook his head, a flicker of pride crossing his face. "No," he stood firm. "But they wrecked his office and warned him there'd be more to come." Ruth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "He's putting himself in danger for us, for all of us," Tom corrected. "Sam's risking everything to expose Hayes. We can't let him stand alone." I stood, my resolve hardening. "Then we don't. The story goes live tomorrow. By the time Hayes tries to retaliate, the damage will already be done." The room fell silent, the gravity of the situation settling over us. Ben broke the quiet, his voice small but steady. "What happens to us after that?" "After the story's out, we keep fighting," Tom said firmly. "Hayes won't go down easy, but once the truth is out, he'll lose his hold on the town. People will see him for what he is. And if they don't?" Ruth asked, her worry evident. Tom looked at her, his expression softening. "Then we keep standing, no matter what." The next morning, the town woke to a bombshell. Copies of the Tribune hit doorsteps and counters across the area. The headline in bold, accusing letters, "Corruption in our midst. Local sheriff exposed." The article detailed Hayes's financial crimes and his reign of intimidation, bolstered by photos of the ledgers and first-hand accounts from Mary and others who had worked under him. At first, the reaction was muted, as if the town couldn't believe what it was seeing. But by midday, the whispers turned into conversations, and the conversations turned into outrage. People began gathering at the courthouse, demanding answers. Hayes, for the first time, was on the defensive. The diner became a hub of activity, filled with people who had once been too afraid to speak out. They came to thank Tom, to offer their support, and to plan the next steps. Reverend Collins arrived with a group from the church, his presence galvanizing the crowd. By evening, the sheriff's office was empty. Hayes had fled, leaving behind a legacy of fear that was finally beginning to crumble. The town wasn't healed overnight, but the tide had turned. That evening, as the diner quieted down, Tom and I sat on the porch, the cool air carrying the faint sounds of life returning to the streets. "We did it," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. No, I corrected, smiling faintly. You did it. You and the people who finally stood up. Tom nodded, his expression thoughtful. I couldn't have done it without you. You didn't need me, I said. You just needed to believe it was possible. He smiled, a rare moment of peace settling over him. For the first time in a long time, the fight felt winnable. Not over, but winnable. As the stars began to appear overhead, I leaned back, letting the exhaustion of the last few days wash over me. The war in this small town had been fought not with weapons, but with courage and truth. And for now, that was enough.